Software evaluation criteria can be explained through an analogy of buying a nice sports car. Now, the sports car has all kind of fancy gadgets and tech inside and outside of the car. And as a valuable customer, you want to make sure that the car lives up to its marketing hype in that it's secure and functional. And this is where the evaluation criteria comes in. But first, let's imagine that the car's brand is known as ISC squared. And the model is the CISSP and CCSP, which are the exams that you are studying for. And let's say this car goes for around $600,000. So for that kind of money, you want to make sure the appropriate due diligence through security assurance and appropriate evaluation criteria have been undertaken either by a third party or internal party. Because let's imagine the manufacturer's motto was the most cyber secure sports car on the market. But should we as cybersecurity professionals believe this marketing hype at face value? The answer is absolutely not. So the question is, how do we evaluate that this hype is actually true? Well, this is where you'd expect the manufacturer or even the car dealer to perform some sort of security evaluation or assessment on the car and all its functionality and tech. And the outcome of that would be some sort of report to provide us, the valuable customer, with some sort of assurance that this car is the real deal. Now, at a very high level, the assurance process would go something like this. The vendor would create a product, e.g. a car, and the vendor would pay an independent party to test that car. And the independent party would test the car using an evaluation criteria, giving it a rating and a final report. That final report, conducted by the independent party, can then be handed by the vendor to its customers to ensure that they know that assurance has taken place. And not just any assurance, but assurance against a reputable evaluation criteria. So what exactly is an evaluation criteria and what are the different types? Great question, and this is where it gets technical, so let's deep dive. So evaluation criteria, you can think of this like a framework. And I covered frameworks in a separate technical video in the context of governance GRC, which I have linked here if you are interested. But for the context of this video, I'm going to talk about software evaluation criteria, starting with the oldest. In 1983 in the United States, there was the Trusted Computer System Evaluation Criteria. That's the acronym TCSEC. And TCSEC is often known as the Orange Book, because it was one book out of a series of books known as the Rainbow Series or Rainbow Books. And these Rainbow Books were created by the US government, specifically the Department of Defense (DoD) and the National Computer Security Center (NCSC). Now, this Rainbow series was a pretty big deal back then. You see, this was the earliest foundational US government computer security standard, setting the criteria for assessing security functionality and assurance. Important technical keynote: whilst the TCSEC does touch on the CIA Triad, that's confidentiality, integrity, and availability, its main focus is around confidentiality. Furthermore, as part of the Rainbow series, there's many other coloured books that focus on different aspects of security, such as the Red Book for networks and the Green Book for password management, etc. But for the purposes of this video, we're going to focus on the Orange Book, which is about the TCSEC. And here are some further technical notes. The TCSEC was only designed to evaluate the confidentiality, and not only that, it was designed for single standalone machines or boxes. That means machines not connected to the internet. I repeat, not connected to the internet. Now let's dive a little bit deeper. There are 4 main divisions within TCSEC. These are the divisions of D, C, B, and A. And across these divisions, there are 7 distinct security levels. So let's go even further and break down these divisions, starting with Division D, which is known as Minimal Protection. And Minimal Protection is obviously the lowest possible rating, known as D1, meaning that the product failed testing or wasn't even tested. This moves us on to the next division, which is Division C, known as Discretionary Protection. This means that the product provides weak or limited protection controls, but does have some controls. And the levels under the C division is C1, C2. And Division B is where it gets interesting, known as Mandatory Protection, which is where labelling became a thing. And there are 3 levels under this division, known as B1, B2 and B3. And that leads us to the final but best division, known as Division A. Division A is Verified Protection, which is the highest possible functional rating that a product can achieve. This basically means a product is very secure, based on mathematical fundamental design. And that is the divisions of TCSEC. Now, whilst the TCSEC was going on in America, around the 1990s a new criteria was being developed in Europe. This would be known as the Information Technology Security Evaluation Criteria, or ITSEC. And ITSEC was designed to be more flexible and comprehensive compared to the USTC-SEC, because the USTC-SEC focused tightly on military confidentiality, whereas the ITSEC brought a more holistic CIA Triad, confidentiality, integrity, and availability principles, and it essentially separated functionality from assurance. Furthermore, ITSEC had 6 evaluation levels known as E1 to E6. Now, for your CISSP and CCSP exams, there's no need to remember all these levels in ITSEC because it was soon replaced with a new common criteria. This common criteria essentially became an ISO or IEC standard. This is the 15408. I repeat, the common criteria is the ISO IEC 15408. And essentially, common criteria built upon the good work of ITSEC but made it even better, essentially making it more international and modernized. And more importantly, the common criteria replaced both TCSEC and ITSEC. So with that said, let's do a technical deep dive into the common criteria. Now, to set the scene, the common criteria was officially released in 1998. However, development was ongoing since the early 1990s. Because remember, as mentioned earlier, there was various standards across the world that needed to be amalgamated, and this is what the purpose of the common criteria was. And so in 1999, the common criteria became internationally adopted under the ISO IEC 15408. Now, to really understand the common criteria, we need to understand some historical context and some limitations from the previous standards we mentioned, starting with the TCSEC. And to further help visualize this historical context, let's take a popular sports car from the 90s. Whilst this isn't like the computer cars of today, let's imagine the historical context being the TCSEC, the Orange Book, being applied to this 90s sports car. So if we apply the TCSEC, the Orange Book, this would mean that we'd have to kit the car out to a military level grade to make it super secure. Because the TCSEC ensures that classified intelligence never leaks between clearance levels. As remember earlier in the video, we talked about the divisions being Division D, Division C, Division B, and Division A. And ultimately, in each of these divisions, there's very strict controls. So you can think of this analogy as kitting out the USA President's car, or even a secret FBI agent's car. Now, this strict military level classification is great for that kind of thing, but what about A, the rest of the world, and B, cars that don't need that level of very strict classifications? And so this is why the rest of the world, aka non-USA and non-TCSEC based countries, decided to start working on the ITSEC, the Information Technology Security Evaluation Criteria. And the most important thing to remember about the ITSEC is that it separated security functions from security assurance. And this is essentially what allowed the CIA Triad and was vastly different from the TCSEC, which was very strict and didn't really apply the full CIA Triad. It just focused on one element, confidentiality, because it was all about military, whereas the ITSEC was a lot more vast and broad. So ITSEC could be applied more generically to companies and businesses that weren't necessarily military, and this leads us to an important keynote. The common criteria took this ITSEC distinction of functional, which means what a system should do, and assurance, which means how do we verify test the function works correctly. And this distinction was chosen over the TCSEC and thus built into the common criteria. But just before we go into the common criteria, I just want to finish on ITSEC, because whilst I want to briefly touch upon this because it's not that important since the common criteria replaced it, but nonetheless for full historical technical context, I like to give the background. Because in my own studies I found that other websites and YouTube videos do not go into the full historical context and are very poor at explaining things. So on that note, ITSEC, unlike TCSEC, can be used to evaluate the level of assurance that a product can provide. And these are covered under levels or evaluation levels or E levels, and there are 7 of these, starting with E0 to E6. That is, if you count from 0 like an array up to number 6, that equals 7. And with these levels, you can measure the confidence in a system's security functionality, which is also known as the target of evaluation, TOE. And just so you know, all these ITSEC levels correspond to one of the TCSEC levels. But don't get bogged down with all this detail. All you need to know for your CISSP and CCSP exam is imagine that the ITSEC is like the car that doesn't need all the bells and whistles to make it really secure. It's a bit more flexible, but has probably more assurance testing as well as security testing. And the reason for explaining this historical context through this car analogy is that when we move on now to the common criteria, you'll understand what the levels of that are, which are closely linked to ITSEC and ultimately replace both ITSEC and TCSEC together. And here's one more CISSP CCSP exam tip. TCSEC was originally focused on standalone single computer systems, whereas ITSEC was designed for network systems, e.g. more than one computer, aka the target of evaluation. But ultimately, the common criteria replaced both of these, meaning the common criteria can be used for both commercial and government systems or products. So, on that note, let's deep dive into the common criteria. So, from ITSEC, the common criteria use similar evaluation levels, this time known as EAL, and they were levels 1 to 7. Now, each of these EAL evaluation levels came with their own levels of assurance, which also came with cost and complexity to implement. But I won't go into all the details, but I'll list all the levels here on the screen. But what I will say for your CISSP and CCSP exams is the keynotes that the purpose of these EAL levels is not to declare a product secure, but to show how thoroughly it has been examined or tested. In other words, each EAL level provides a certain level of assurance depending on what your needs are. But for the most part, as a general rule of thumb, the EAL levels 1 to 4 cover the majority of IT commercial products, and the EAL levels of 5 to 7 are reserved for specialized high assurance security products, which also can include specialized national security and government systems. Now, under the common criteria, you may also come across the terms of protection profiles, PPs. And the protection profiles are essentially a set of independent security requirements for a specific product, e.g. firewalls, smart cards, etc., ensuring a consistent level of standards across these. And you may also hear the term security targets, which refer to the targets of evaluations, and these are essentially security claims or implementation of dependent documents that define the target of evaluation security features, often claiming conformance to one or more PPs, protection profiles. And to bring this full circle, the common criteria has replaced TCSEC and ITSEC and remains highly relevant and is still actively used today as the premier international standard for evaluating IT product security. So common criteria is a pretty big deal. Now here are a few extra CISSP and CCSP exam tips that you should be aware of. You may hear the term certification. Now certification is a comprehensive technical evaluation of a system's security controls, aka doing the testing and checking. And the certification is usually based on an evaluation criteria, such as the TCSEC, ITSEC, which has now been replaced by the common criteria. And once certification, aka testing, is complete, the next stage is accreditation, which is the final rubber stamp of approval. That is to say, a product or system is accredited to be certified against a certain evaluation criteria or framework. And here's a bonus tip. These two terms, certification and accreditation, are old compliance terms which have now been replaced with the ATO, Authorization to Operate, or Authority to Operate. And the ATO aligns with the NIST Risk Management Framework, RMF, about ongoing risk assessments and acceptance by senior officials. I hope you found this video enjoyable and informative. If you did, it would be awesome if you could like and subscribe if not already to help support this new channel's growth. As I am a small content creator, ladies and gents, and so every single like and subscribe really does help push this video and channel further and further up YouTube. So please don't be shy to hit that like and subscribe. Thank you for watching today's video. I hope you enjoyed the content as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you would like to see more content like this, it would be super fantastic if you could leave a like and subscribe to help support this channel's growth.